Hello and welcome to the latest in the recent series of City UK policy webinars. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Miles Selleck and I'm the Chief Executive of the City UK. It's great to welcome you to what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion on what is a highly topical subject, which is of course the future of globalisation, an area that is of enormous interest to our industry, and has been a huge area of focus for the City UK in its work, not just in recent weeks and months, but in preceding years. As an industry that is highly international in its nature, highly international in the audiences and the customers that it serves and engages with, it's natural that our industry would have enormous anxieties over a regression in globalization and a move to protectionism and regulatory isolationism, which is one of the reasons why we have been especially encouraged by the work of the Department of International Trade here in the UK and the approach that we've seen from UK government on these issues. To discuss these subjects today, we have an enormously prestigious and expert panel, and I'm delighted that they will be able to share their views and insights with us today. They are, in order of speaking, Liz Truss, the International Trade Secretary. Delighted that she can join us what is obviously a hugely important and crucial time for our industry. Liz has been in post since June 2019 and is also the Minister for Women and Equalities, and has had a number of highly important cabinet roles before this, including as Lord Chancellor, DEFRA Secretary, and indeed as Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Delighted that she can join us, especially given the importance of her role as a champion for open trading relationships in a post-COVID world. Also joining us on the panel, Dr. Gerard Lyons. Gerard is a leading expert on the global economy and has advised Boris Johnson in the Prime Minister's time as Mayor of London, and has a distinguished career in financial services, not least with Standard Chartered, and perhaps a little more modestly as a former board member of the City UK. He's one of the most recognisable and respected economists in the country, and we're delighted that he can join us to share his thoughts on the global economy and how we can continue to promote free trade. I'm also absolutely delighted that we can be joined by Linda Yueh. Linda is an economist at Oxford University, at London Business School, and at the London School of Economics, and she is chair of the LSE Economic Diplomacy Commission, which examines the UK's foreign economic policy. And what we'll do in terms of format is that each of our speakers will offer their perspectives for about 5 minutes or so, and we will then have a brief panel discussion and open it up to questions from the audience. For those of you who are not familiar with the system, at the bottom of your screen there is a button you can press to put a question to me, which I will put on your behalf to the panelists, or alternatively you can email me or send me a text message and I will pass the question on in that format. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn to the first of our speakers, Liz Truss. Liz, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Miles, for that introduction. Over the last few months, as we've experienced the COVID crisis, I think what we've seen is the resilience of free trade and global supply chains, because despite this global health emergency, we've seen continued supplies of food and medicines, continued supplies of goods around the world, and a commitment really to free trade continuing from all the major players. One of the things we did early on in the crisis is help convene a meeting of the G20 trade ministers and secured a resolution of the importance of free trade, and also the importance that any measures taken by countries were proportionate and time limited. And I think people recognise, broadly speaking, that protectionism would simply exacerbate the impact of the severe health crisis that we're facing. And in fact, we're seeing trade falling at a faster rate than global GDP. And we expect 30% of the impact on the UK economy to be the impact of global trends. If we look at past history, of course, a rise in protectionism at a time like this has simply exacerbated an economic crisis. The classic example, and we've been talking about the 1930s this week and the New Deal, but of course, the rise in protectionism we saw at that time helped fuel the global depression. So we're very clear as the United Kingdom that that needs to be avoided at all costs, and we're working very hard with partner and allies across the world. And the title of this talk is about globalisation. And I think globalisation has become a bit of a loaded word. It means different things to different people. And there is certainly a pushback against the idea that a country's sovereignty can be trampled on by international organisations, or somehow countries' self-determination is threatened. But I think that's very different from the idea that countries should cooperate and trade together. And I think there is a growing appetite for that to happen. At the same time as we've seen protectionist rhetoric during this crisis and protectionist measures, such as import and export restrictions, we've also seen a number of countries lower barriers to trade. And indeed, in the United Kingdom, we've removed tariffs from health products, for example, and are a leading part of seeing seeing that debate change. There has been quite a bit of talk about repatriation of supply chains and the idea that self-sufficiency might somehow help countries in this crisis. Now, in my view, that is a false promise. What we know about autarky or self-sufficiency is actually very unresilient because a country could be subject to a specific economic shock with no alternatives. What we want is a resilient trade policy where we're trading with more countries, where we're less dependent on single countries, either for our imports and our exports. And we have clarity about supply chains, and we have choices. And that is very much what we're focused on as the UK government. We also see a growth in trade as a key way of helping us recover from the coronavirus crisis. So if you look at the trade negotiations that we're currently engaged in at the Department of International Trade, what they all have in common is that they show that they will help the government's levelling up agenda. So the US deal, for example, will particularly benefit the Midlands, the north of England and Scotland, key manufacturing areas that currently face high tariffs in those goods. So if there is an appetite for trade and cooperation between sovereign nations, what does this look like? What does it look like for the UK? Well, first of all, a key part of our agenda, now that we're becoming an independent trading nation for the first time in 40 years, is to put ourselves at the centre of a network of free trade agreements, giving us access to global markets. Of course, we're negotiating with the European Union. That is not my specific role, that is David Frost, who's conducting that from Task Force Europe. But we're also in negotiations with the US, with Japan, Australia and New Zealand, and we are seeking accession to CPTPP. And the aim of that policy is so that we are able to have access to those markets, but also able to trade freely with those markets. First of all, for the sheer economic benefit. There are very few government policies that can deliver the level of GDP change as removing trade barriers. We also want to hitch ourselves to the fastest growing parts of the world, Asia Pacific being a key example. But trade agreements are also important to protect against protectionism. So it's not just the upside benefit we're talking about, it's also protecting against the downside risk, keeping those markets open in goods and in services, giving protection to companies, knowing that those markets will continue to be open and that the goods and services they sell will be trusted in those markets. And the final point I'd make is I think it's really important we strike strategic alliances with like-minded nations. It is why we've set out to join CPTPP. It's a high-quality trade agreement with high standards. It's a strong rules-based agreement. And we think that agreements like that, as well as a strong agreement with the US, are a good way of setting global standards and making sure that we challenge some of the unfair practices, whether that's forced technology transfer, whether it's artificial subsidies by state-owned enterprises. So we also think it's an important part of shaping the global trading system alongside reform of the World Trade Organization. And that is another key focus as we seek to select a new Director General of the World Trade Organization. We need somebody who's a champion of free trade, who's going to champion the rules-based system, and who's going to break the deadlocks that have emerged in the World Trade Organization. Finally, I'm just going to come on to the benefits for financial services and professional services of these agreements. We're already the second largest exporter of professional services in the world. If you look at the US and the UK together, we are two of the biggest financial services markets. That represents 40% of global exports. So that in itself is a huge opportunity. And we're looking for much better regulatory dialogue with the US. We're looking for much better underpinning in terms of data, digital, free flow of data, non-data localization clauses. And those are also benefits that we can achieve with Japan, with Australia, New Zealand, and with CPTPP. So whether it's about cross-border trade access, regulatory cooperation, and also recognition of professional qualifications and the ability of professionals to travel across borders, all of those things are absolutely critical to the financial services industry and the professional and business services areas. And we are championing those in all of the trade agreements we strike. That's a brief summary of where we are at the moment. Be happy to answer any questions.
So Secretary of State, thank you very much indeed for that fantastic overview of where things are, which is enormously appreciated. And thank you again on behalf of the industry for the work that you and your colleagues are doing on that agenda. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Gerard Lyons, who will set out his thoughts on the direction of the global economy. Gerard, over to you.
Great. Well, good morning. Thank you, Miles, for your kind introduction earlier. It's a great pleasure, great honour to share the podium with the Secretary of State and also with Linda as well. So, pleasure to be here, and thank you for asking me. The future of globalisation. Let me address this by focusing on three areas. First, what will not change? We often talk about what will change as a result of this crisis, but first, I think we should remind ourselves of what's likely to not change. Second, what will change in terms of globalization? And third and finally, the implications. I think a key message I would like to stress is that now is not the time to become negative or bearish about either the UK or the global economy, despite considerable near-term uncertainty. But first, what will not change? I think as we start to move from the health crisis and into the economic recovery phase, what we're likely to see is a re-emergence of some of the key pre-crisis drivers, both globally and nationally. And back before this crisis hit us hard, some of the international trends were very evident and were likely to be very long-lasting. I would summarize those as perspiration and inspiration and the emergence of the G2. Perspiration is demographic change. That will be a constant driver, and it will not change as a result of this crisis. Big new markets, big young populations to sell into from a trade perspective, including a financial markets perspective. Inspiration as well is vitally important. This is characterized by the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence and technology. These are key drivers that will be there regardless of what one thinks as a result of this COVID crisis. Here in London, we're already seeing London really establish itself as the centre of fintech, highlighting the innovation evident already in the city. But for wider financial services, the key areas as a result of that technological change and the fourth industrial revolution are the digital and data revolution. As a result of this crisis, we might see an increased focus on data democracy, who owns the data, a greater focus on the oversight of the data in terms of transparency and secrecy, and the whole digital side, which City UK have written about, very much focuses, I would say, near term on the relationship between the UK and the US, given their importance in financial services. The G2 is the fact that I think we've moved already from a G20 to a G7 to the focus on the G2. That will be seen in terms of maybe increased trade tensions, the geopolitical tensions between the US and China, and of course, from the city's perspective, China's push down the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think creates a great opportunity for the city. On top of that, to conclude this first part, what will not change is also the domestic agenda in terms of the levelling up side, as well as the move to a green economy. So the city very much needs to be like the Roman god Janus, with two heads looking in different directions. One domestically, because I think there will be greater calls for the city to play a role here at home, but that should not undermine the city's global perspective. That leads on to the second part, in terms of globalisation. What might change as a result of this crisis? Well, obviously we don't know, but we can speculate or make educated guesses. After the SARS crisis in 2003, and I was heavily involved in that in terms of running global research at Standard Chartered at the time, it was then said, back then, that much would change. But 18 months after SARS, consumer and business behaviour had effectively returned to normal. But one thing that really did change, and I think was evident in the last few months, in terms of how East Asia prepared for and coped with the current COVID crisis, is that following SARS, there was a greater focus on building resilience into national systems. That was in terms of preparation for future shocks. I think after this crisis, there will be a desire to build greater resilience into systems, whether it's health systems or indeed in terms of the corporate sector itself, building more slack into supply chains. I think investors themselves will not only look to invest in cost competitive companies, they will also be looking to invest in risk competitive companies as well. Post the global financial crisis in 2008, it was also said that deglobalization would replace globalization. It didn't. What we actually saw post the global financial crisis in the area of global financial sector was greater cooperation, actually, in some respects, to ensure that that crisis could not be repeated. The Financial Stability Board came very much to the fore. One wonders whether this time we'll see greater cooperation in terms of global health. But from the city's perspective, the Bank for International Settlements did a lot of work on globalization and deglobalization in the financial sphere. And back in 2007, if I could quote one of the key conclusions they came up with, was this: what appears to be a global shrinkage of international banking is confined to European banks. In actual fact, they said other banking systems were building their global footprint. The US, Japan, and Canada, they cited. Being on the board of Bank of China in the UK, I would also cite that China, like other international emerging economies, are continuing to build their global footprint. But there will be some things that really do change as a result of this crisis. More resilience will be built into systems, as I mentioned, but that will also likely see governments favouring domestic players when it comes to government procurement, and also favouring domestic players in terms of all aspects of national security. I tend to think the changes as a result of this crisis can be captured by 3 Gs: grassroots, green, and geopolitics. All important for the City of London. Grassroots is a greater focus on how the city and financial services more generally can serve the grassroots of their own economies. Green, I think there will be greater global pressure to address the green agenda. And as I touched on earlier, geopolitics and tensions. What that means for globalization can be seen in different respects if we think of goods, services, people, capital, and ideas. There will be changes in the supply chains when it comes to goods. For services, it's very difficult to see how there will be big changes, but the rule of law becomes a very important feature still, how that plays out. When it comes to people, there will be a differentiation between skilled and unskilled, reinforcing some of the trends evident in recent years. Capital flows will be impacted. The ability of, say, China to come in and buy different companies may be constrained. And ideas, intellectual property rights will have to be safeguarded. That comes on to the final part, the implications. One thing I think it's important to stress is it's premature to say that we will go from globalization to deglobalization. This pandemic will be a catalyst for change in some areas, but I think what it's more likely to be is that globalization needs adjustment, maybe less so in services than in manufacturing. The Secretary of State touched on the global Britain aspect being at the center of networks of free trade. I think that's the right way to go. I would like to see it as Britain being an ally of the US, a friend of China, and a trade partner to all. But I think it's very important, as she touched on, to actually focus on some of the big future markets. The shift in the balance of power is likely to see the emergence of the Indo-Pacific region, stretching from India in the west to America in the east as the driver of future global growth. These are key markets for Britain to want to play a part in, and for the city itself to want to be very heavily involved in. Financial services clearly need to be competitive, but they also need to cooperate in important areas, whether it's cybersecurity, avoiding regulatory sort of balkanization, as well as supervision. At the end of the day, financial centers thrive in terms of being places where customers want to do business, where the regulatory environment is sound, and where the infrastructure is strong and supportive. I think London will still be a place that people want to do business in and to do business from. But finally, the point that I think that needs to change as a result of this crisis is the whole institutional framework governing key things, such as the G20. On the eve of this crisis, the G20 met in Riyadh. They had one sentence at the end of their first paragraph mentioning the COVID crisis. Less than 6 hours later, Italy was effectively declaring a state of emergency. I think we need to see a new global institutional framework. Maybe we need to have a G20 Secretariat, a permanent one, rather than rotating year by year. And if so, London, I think, should pitch for it. But certainly when one looks at the implications, I think there's lots of reasons to think that we will not go from globalization to deglobalization, but will we see a more nuanced change. And I think the City of London still needs to pitch hard, still needs to try and influence the agenda, but ultimately I think we'll still come out of this quite well. Thank you for your time.
Gerard, many thanks for that. Really, as ever, enormously thought-provoking and extremely insightful. Looking forward to exploring that in the questions later. We now turn to our final speaker, Dr. Linda Yueh. Linda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Miles. And indeed, thank you very much to the City UK team for inviting me to do this very topical webinar alongside the Secretary of State and Gerard. So it's a pleasure. And in my opening few minutes, I'm going to focus on 3 areas that the City UK team hopefully suggested that I might look at. I would say, mention again that I am the chair of the LSE Commission on Economic Diplomacy. So quite a lot of what I'm going to say on the future of globalization are questions that the Commission is currently looking at. So I thought what I would do is go through what the 21st century trade and global economic system looks like. The second thing I'll focus on is how trade can help our recovery. And then finally, a bit on Britain's place in the world, because the 21st century global economy is an era for greater economic diplomacy. So to kick off, the 21st century global economy will look very different than the 20th. And I think all of us have already experienced that. And I think for the services sector in particular, this is a very exciting time. So what we have seen are two major trends, which is the growth of services trade and the growth of digitalization, including of trade and of data. So these are fast-growing areas of global trade, but without a lot of institutional framework around it. And I'll come to that at the end, but I think that's where there is an opportunity. The other big trend we see is that foreign direct investment has been declining since 2015. And there has also been a slowdown in growth. So foreign direct investment, of course, slowing down 5 years ago, predates the pandemic, and it's when the global economy was already recovering. What that's suggesting is this trend of growth of what's called the invisible balance. So services, digital trade, all of this may actually be becoming even more important, as the typical things that get measured well are physical goods and trade. So there could be more cross-border investment if we were able to liberalize some of these areas better. But I'm using that as an example because I think we can get quite pessimistic about this slowdown in global investment or trade. But I think there's a lot of measurement issues around the invisible balance. So in many ways, that plus the fact there's a backlash against globalization means the 21st century will need to think harder about how to regain an economic consensus on trade and multilateralism. So I think my sort of takeaway here is that to think of all trade, investment, foreign economic policies as being domestic. So we know that trade affects, for instance, the distribution of income, but it goes further than that, which I'll say more about in a moment. So think of all policies as being domestic, which means domestic fiscal policies as well as trade policies and other policies need to be better integrated. The second point I wanted to just touch on is how trade can help with our recovery from this pandemic. Now, of course, traditionally, exports do help with recoveries. The challenge with this pandemic is that pretty much all countries are suffering. However, they're suffering at different times. So the pandemic basically means we need to think about, in terms of British exporters, nimbly shifting between foreign markets because they will go through lockdown and easing of restrictions at different times, which means it does require a greater degree of adeptness. Now, making British industry, British services more adept is actually itself the strongest driver of competitiveness in trade. So, of course, foreign agreements, free trade agreements, all of that matters hugely. The source of where our comparative advantage lies, it's been known since the time of David Ricardo, is our own productivity and efficiency. So, for instance, if we were a very efficient, productive, ICT-driven economy, the UK is already in the top 10 by a number of measures, and is able to be productive during social distancing. All of that is going to help essentially our external position, our trade position. So focusing on strengthening and shaping our comparative advantage by doing something which is very challenging, which is to be as productive during a period of social distancing, will require a greater digital infrastructure, greater skills, and changes in business norms. So I think in that way, we can think about at least the near term, taking advantage, I think, of where Britain does have strengths to really strengthen competitiveness in that sense. And that will help the overall trade position while access to foreign markets are being negotiated. And then the final few comments that I was going to make was around Britain's place in the world. So as I said at the beginning, I think the 21st century global economy is an era for economic diplomacy. So what does that mean? There has to be consistency between trade and investment policies with the principles and values of the country, its own economic system, its foreign policies. So the aim here would be to balance commercial openness with foreign and domestic aims centered around values and principles. And that would be the framework to examine a number of things. So I think that's something hopefully we can talk a bit more about. The second point I would make about thinking of where Britain can play a role in this changed global economy is being a leader in promoting a rules-based multilateral system that looks after global public goods. So environment, health, these are all areas in which there does need to be, I think, a much greater consensus around doing something to help with coordinating these and other issues. And I think this is where Britain can also play a role. And what it does is it strengthens the multilateral system, not just in terms of rules, but in terms of norms, by putting forward policy suggestions, building coalitions to help with global public goods that we all care about. And then finally, I think to be a hub in the 21st century global economy will be very important. So Britain could be a global hub for services broadly defined. It already is an international financial center. But given the trades of services growth and digital trade and growth, it's even more important to think about positioning Britain within overlapping trade jurisdictions. So in other words, most countries in the world have preferential free trade agreements, but not in a multilateral sense. So by sitting between countries that don't have free trade agreements, Britain can be a global hub for services. So for instance, China, US, they're not going to have a free trade agreement anytime soon, sitting between those countries. Similarly, EU, China, EU, US, I think that's how you can really position yourself as the conduit for trade in services. And then the challenge here, of course, is considerable, as we all know, because a lot of trade in services and data is around norms and standards, and that does require a degree of harmonization. I'll just use data as an example, and then pause for a discussion. Is data norms are very different in these various economic blocks and countries that I've mentioned. So I'm just going to use a gross generalization, and this is a gross generalization, that in China, the state owns your data. In the United States, companies own your data. In Europe, we own our data. So finding common ground on one of the most important areas of the 21st century is going to be important. But I think as someone said, it's going to be hard, but everything that is worthwhile is hard. So I hope we can all try and meet that challenge. So with that, I'll pause. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Linda, thank you very much for that. Also really insightful and very thought-provoking. If I could ask Liz Truss and Gerard Lyons to unmute and turn their videos on as well, we will move to the discussion part of the event. We've already had a number of questions come in, and there are literally more coming in on my screen as I speak. But before I turn to those, I'd just like to pick up on something that Gerard raised, and which I'd be really interested in the panel's views on. And Gerard, you talked about the G20 and the fact the G20 has not delivered in the way that it could have done. And when you look at when one looks at the response to the global financial crisis 12 years ago, the G20, this was the G20's great moment. You know, it was at the heart of coordinating the monetary policy response. It was at the heart of driving an approach to economic policy globally, coordination. And it was a great moment for the UK because Gordon Brown and the UK government at the time were very much seen as leading the charge. There's been nothing of that sort of approach in response to the COVID crisis. None of the current members of the G7 or G20 appear to have sort of taken the mantle that Gordon Brown took. What lessons have we learned, and what should we do differently as a result of this? And what organisational, institutional changes should we perhaps put in place? And Gerard, given that you raised this first, perhaps I can start with you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, in fact, I think we've had two golden periods for global coordination. The G7 Plaza Accord Day, if we go far enough back to 1985, 86, 87 periods. And you're right, the G20 period, initiated by George Bush and then Gordon Brown, very much on the back of that. I think the challenge is that too many countries talk globally or act nationally, or if we look at the continent at the moment, talk regionally and act nationally, as we've seen in this crisis. But in terms of your question, I think part of the challenge with the G20 is not that there's a common need amongst all these countries, because one would think in terms of a global health crisis, there's something that should unite them. I think the challenge is actually having the framework there, the institutional framework, to put it all together. My own perception is that having a rotating political G20 presidency allows each country to tick their domestic box, but it means that too many things fall through the cracks, and themes that become important don't last the length of time because a new national player has something it wants to push. That is, whoever has the presidency 1 year pushes other things to the forefront. What I think could help would be to have a permanent G20 Secretariat in this particular area, or indeed some people have suggested having a smaller number of countries. But I think given that the IMF and World Bank have yet to fully grasp the change in terms of the global financial system and bringing India, China more into the centre, I think allowing the G20 to have a permanent secretariat, international secretariat based in one country would, in my view, be a positive step forward.
Thank you, Gerard. Liz Truss?
Thank you, Miles. Well, I certainly agree with the general point about leadership on free trade. And I do think the UK is in a very good position to help broker further agreement. You know, the Prime Minister made a very strong speech on the subject in Greenwich. It's one of our key priorities, along with addressing climate change. And you know, I think you will see more in this space from the UK. In terms of the institutional framework, to me, it's actually about bringing together some of the key interlocutors. And that's where I think we are well positioned with both the EU and the US, for example. I think we can show leadership in a lot of our bilateral and plurilateral talks that we're currently engaged in, whether that's with the United States, with CPTPP. And I think it's very interesting that CPTPP, there are a lot of countries now getting on the list for membership. So there is a desire, people are voting with their feet, countries are voting with their feet to be part of these broader rules-based trade agreements. And the other opportunity, which I highlighted earlier, is the new Director Generalship of the World Trade Organization. And getting somebody in that job who can show the relevant political leadership and also bring the different parts of the global trading system together will be extremely important. So I don't think something will happen overnight, but I do think that a lot of the key players who I speak to recognize things need to change, recognize the WTO does need to be reformed and strengthened, and recognize that there does need to be leadership from leading trading nations. And certainly, you know, whether it's Japan, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, you know, we've been working with them, we've been working with Singapore on some of these issues. I think there is an opportunity to build a coalition of the willing, whether it will be through the G20 or the G10 idea that the UK has been proposing. We need to bring together a coalition of the willing to make it happen.
Great, thank you very much. Linda?
And I'd agree with that. I think one of the characteristics of the 21st century global economy is that there are a number of gaps in terms of governance on a global level, whether it's putting teeth behind services trade, looking after global public goods, or this new round of the WTO led by a pluralistic group of countries around digitalization of trade, data trade, and that was launched last year. So what I think we need are new institutions and almost leave the mindset of the past and think about the future as being importantly networks of countries that can work together to set agreed rules as well as norms. And I think that's the other big change that I would highlight, which is we do need reform of the 20th century institutions, but what we need in the 21st century are also its buy-in, which means setting norms and standards that your domestic populace is happy with, that looks distributionally fair, and is able to bring together countries to coalesce behind it and try to get away from some of the stalemate of the past. Now, what Gerald mentioned about the Secretariat is something that the Commission has recommended. Gerard helpfully appeared before the LSE Commission. It's actually in our last interim report that we think there should be some type of Secretariat. But I want to say this in the lightest possible way, because there's a lot of hesitation about expensive new bureaucracies. And again, remember what I said about everything has to have a buy-in. So, but what you need in the 21st century is a platform, is a network of sharing technical knowledge on the environment, of building consensus so that businesses know what the emerging norm is. Bringing in businesses as stakeholders to set those norms and regulations will be different for every industry, every sector, whether it's financial services, professional services, ICT. Every group, every sector has its own leading body, and those, I think, need to play a bigger part in setting some of these global norms and best practice and sharing. And to me, that's how you could break some of the deadlock of the past and actually move into having a greater degree of harmonization, and then therefore the ability to open up services trade and digital trade.
Great, thank you. A question here from Norman Blackwell, Lord Blackwell. How do the panel gauge the risks of engagement with China, and how should we balance that against the opportunities of what is becoming one of the world's two major economies? Linda, is this something that the Commission has looked at from an economic diplomacy perspective? And
we have, and we continue to look at it. The report is due out early next year, and this is actually one of the, all joking aside, this is one of the big questions of our time. Now, some of the IR specialists would say we are now in the era of great powers. Now, that is challenging when the geo-economic tensions between the two economic superpowers are increasing, not lessening. And it is an area where I think fundamentally, regardless of the US administration, the underlying tensions there are significant. So engaging with China and the US, absolutely. Can you do it while being an honest broker, putting forward norms? I think would actually be very helpful if it's very specific. So in other words, in my area, if you want to think about liberalization of the invisible balance trade in services and digital, you have to be very specific on the exact standards and norms you're negotiating. And, and that plus trying to reconcile your own foreign policy aims as a country with your commercial openness. That's something every country needs to do for itself. And there will be no, but I see it as an opportunity for non-economic superpowers to take this role, because I can, just on the WTO point mentioned, by the Secretary of State, chances are the US and China are going to find it really hard to come to an agreement on a candidate. But it doesn't mean we don't need a Director General of the WTO. It means other countries need to come up with something that doesn't immediately, result in a kind of, I suggested it, so therefore the side doesn't like it. You need to, the only way to get through the era of great powers, I guess, is to be the honest broker and find areas where you can have consensus of other countries and then bring them along. So,
thank you, Secretary of State.
Well, there's a lot of rhetoric in the debate about US-China, but the reality is the US have signed a phase 1 trade agreement with China, and that continues to go ahead. So everybody continues to trade with China, and that is the right approach. However, I do think there are issues with China's behavior at the World Trade Organization, particularly on transparency notifications. I think there are broader issues with the World Trade Organization concerning tariff levels, the way that there's been a hold up in terms of liberalisation in areas like digital and services that Linda's been talking about, that does need a breakthrough, but it is going to need brokering because essentially, we do have to have a system where everybody follows the rules. And to me, it's a twin track approach. It's about getting a director general into the World Trade Organization that can broker that new way of working. But it's also about countries building up networks of alliances, of trade agreements that are standards-based, rules-based, and fair, that, as Linda said, command the support of their populations, and therefore challenging countries who aren't prepared to sign up to those rules. So I think it's a combination of both of those two things that have to happen. And this is where I see countries like the UK and Japan being in a very strong position to help influence the shape of that, as, if you like, honest broker countries that aren't, we're not one of the major, we're not one of the top three in the World Trade Organization. So I think we can play that kind of role.
And I think the steps that we've seen between the UK and Japan are very encouraging, and we've certainly been very supportive of. Gerard.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, what's interesting listening to the Secretary of State and to Linda is how they've both used the word networks on a number of occasions. And I think that's a very important part of the future story in many different ways. But when it comes to China, I think it's very important for the UK to deepen its economic and financial relationship with China. In economic terms, just given the scale of China and the likelihood that its economy will continue to grow in terms of importance in the global economy, and naturally, given that its financial sector will continue to grow. It is often said in China that Germany was the country in Europe that benefited from the first phase of development in China, selling capital manufactured goods to China. And it's often said that the UK is very well placed for the next stage of development in China as it becomes more a consumer and service orientated economy. Now, the challenge, and Lord Blackwell's question touches on this, is how one differentiates between economics and finance versus the geopolitics. Most companies, most businesses would like to actually put the geopolitics to one side and just focus on the economics and the financial side. I think that's important, and that's the sensible way to proceed. But naturally, there will be times, and we saw that both last year and the previous year, when geopolitical tensions came to the fore through trade. This year, it's always very difficult in the US election year to really gauge things properly. What's been very evident in each of the last few election years in the States is that China tensions have come to the fore, and they've often tailed away after. One would hope that that is the case this time, notwithstanding the new national security law in Hong Kong. But there undoubtedly will be geopolitical tensions. I don't think we can pretend they're not there, but I think what's clear is that when one has seen political tensions globally before, it's still been possible to do economic and financial business with different countries. And naturally, the other issue with China is its growing sphere of influence in East Asia and the Belt Road. So that very much has an impact in third countries where the City of London can play a key role, and therefore the rule of law and English law, common law, are very important facets and features and exports that we should continue to push globally.
Brilliant, thank you very much. There are a huge number of questions, but not a huge amount of time left. So with the apologies to those who haven't, who won't be chosen, I'm going to try and squeeze in 4 questions together. And if I could ask each of the panelists just to offer 2 minutes on what you will see are a range of subjects that you cannot do justice to in 2 minutes, but in no particular order. And as I warned, the panelists may well turn up as a question. Is there a risk, this is from John Cook, is there a risk that the UK National Security and Investment Bill will contradict the UK stance on globalisation and the fight against protectionism? And can you say anything on this? I suspect that's one especially for the Secretary of State. A question from Jeremy Wilson. Do you see stresses in the current monetary system as a result of the post-pandemic economic stress leading perhaps to currency innovation? I imagine, Gerard, you may well have thoughts on this. A question from Diana Chen. The UK is keen to expand trade and investment ties with China, particularly after Brexit. but the UK cannot ignore the potential impact of the new Hong Kong security law or keep silent on where the UK stands. How can this industry, how can financial and professional services avoid being caught in the dilemma and continue to boost economic ties with China? I think that builds on the discussion we've already had. And the final question from James Palmer, do the panelists share the concerns of many businesses that barriers to free trade are being introduced not just as overt protectionism, but more in the context of other ostensibly benevolent goals, such as the EU's desire to preserve differentiating benefits to EU members on the one hand, or again, a question on national security or supply chain labelled interventions on the other? And how can these best be kept in? Perhaps I can ask the Secretary of State to kick us off.
So first of all, on the investment screening point, we are entering a period where companies will be undervalued, and we do need proper investment screening to protect critical British industries from predatory activity. And in fact, that is being introduced across the world, whether it's Japan, Australia, other countries. Of course, it's vital that we make sure that the UK is an incredibly attractive destination for investment. We already secure 30% of Europe's foreign direct investment. And in fact, we're shortly going to be launching a new investment strategy, which is about upping our game in terms of bringing in more FDI across the world. So it's right that we have rules, and that is true of every leading global economy. But it's very important, it's open, it's transparent, and that we continue to attract investment. I mean, on the subject of China, we are absolutely clear-eyed about China, and you'll have seen the Foreign Secretary's statement about the Hong Kong security law and our very grave concerns about that. There is an important balance to be struck. Continuing to trade with China, as indeed many other of our allies are, whilst at the same time protecting our national security interests, but also our responsibilities with Hong Kong. I mean, on the subject of protectionism, every era has its own excuses for protectionism. Whether it's the infant industry argument or whether it's an argument about environmental protection, these are wheeled out and people will find new excuses. And again, we're finding those excuses in the modern age, particularly to prevent things like digital and services trade. And first of all, we need international institutions that are actually going to address concerns. So in terms of climate change, the right way to approach that is through the COP process. The right way to approach areas like animal welfare standards, again, is through international organizations so that we raise global standards. But I am very keen that we make sure trade agreements are about lowering barriers rather than increasing barriers. And of course, that's a constant challenge as Trade Secretary, and the support of City UK in making those arguments is extremely welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. Gerard?
Thank you. Well, I won't cover John's question on national investment bill. The Secretary of State's covered that. In terms of Diana's question about trade with China and Hong Kong, I feel I covered that in some respect in my answer to Lord Blackwell. So maybe if I could take the other two questions. Jeremy's question about stresses in the international monetary system. Yeah, maybe 3 points I would say here. First, we have had an ongoing issue for some time in terms of the dominance of the dollar within the global system. This is a point often raised in East Asia and led by China. I think what one will see is maybe some passive diversification out of the dollar. People won't actively sell the dollar will still be important. But I think we'll see as global trade changes and networks become more important, that more countries will likely manage their currency against the basket of goods with which they trade. I think the dollar still is very important within that, but China clearly needs to see deeper and broader capital markets, and also governance needs to become an issue there. The other 2 points linked to this is that monetary policy has become the shock absorber over the last decade. Fiscal policy is almost a shock absorber in this crisis. Global debt levels are at an incredibly high level. So we're in a difficult phase. But in an environment of low inflation, low rates and low yields, it's possible to avoid the unsavory consequences of that high debt situation. But it leads on to the feature that monetary and fiscal policy need to be completely integrated. There's lots of talk still of independent central banks, but the last decades has shown that central banks have to be fully involved and integral to the success of government policies, and there needs to be consistency between monetary and fiscal policy. Finally, James's question, I didn't get the full question, but the challenge with having barriers to trade is that they often just provide a short-term relief. It's a sort of way of hiding, and there's a need to recognise there are winners and losers from globalisation. But within the EU, I think there is a big challenge if one looks at the fact that Italy's income per head is still lower now than it was in the year 2000. There are deep structural issues that need to be addressed on the continent within the euro area, and having short-term protectionism hides away from those deep issues that need to be addressed.
Gerard, thank you. Linda, I'm sorry, we are very short on time. In fact, we are actually over time. Any final thoughts from you?
Okay. In that case, maybe I could just touch briefly on James's question, because I think that kind of captures quite a lot of the protectionism issues that we do need to think about. So I think non-tariff measures will increasingly be more important, and these include subsidies and standards, because globally, tariffs, which is on traded goods, have come down quite a lot. Agriculture is a different subject altogether. So this is why I think the 21st century is actually about standards and rules. And essentially, the domestic policies need themselves to be part of consideration in discussing, for instance, free trade agreements. And I would add on top of that, because we need to balance commercial openness with all of these other concerns, foreign and domestic. Having free trade agreements, and not just free trade agreements, investment discussions, other types of equivalence discussions, all of these discussions probably need to have two more things. One is I don't want to quite describe it as the other policy track. So for instance, issues around national security. So for instance, supply chains could form part of that. All that almost needs to be alongside the economic aims, because it is so important to have consistency in a country's overall policies. And then quickly, finally, I think the other side of it is what Gerard mentioned before, is that you really do need to have some degree of global recognition of these things. So once you have enough of a big enough network where you have agreement on, for instance, what are supply chains that are generally deemed to be in need of having a greater overlay to ensure resilience, and then even having an agreement between these countries saying, you know, we will ensure there's a pandemic, we will not impose export restrictions on these items. All of that, I think, would help a great deal. And then finally, just one tip for business, I guess, is every business has to make their own decisions about how they balance the bigger geopolitical picture. But, you know, the prosperity we enjoy today is because of commercial openness across the world. It's not an easy time, but we have to make sure that commercial openness is maintained, and, you know, just keep an eye on those policies that's coming out.
I think that's a great note on which to end, a fantastically positive note on which to end. Thank you very much indeed to our panelists, to Elizabeth Truss, to Gerard Lyons, to Linda Yueh. Thank you very much for everyone who's dialed in and the questions we've had. I look forward to the next of these and to continuing to work with everybody on this call. Thanks very much indeed. Take care. Bye-bye.